It's a great pleasure and privilege to give a talk to this group. As has already been said, I was there right at the start, and I'm really delighted that the turnout, the audience sizes have maintained through all that time. Now, again, as Toby said, now for something very, very different. I hope you're going to get plenty of variety as we go through these presentations. This was the title that I was given, and as I got closer to preparing it, I wish I'd thought of reasons for changing it. But it was quite interesting to take on the challenge and really give some reflection. So there's not going to be any numbers in this. There's not really going to be a huge amount of evidence. It just gave me an opportunity to think through, given my experiences on grants committees and the like, and involvement in various grant proposals, to try and address some of these questions. So, how's it going to work? So this is what I'm going to try and cover. A little bit about research funding, and then on the planning and conduct of it, and a little bit about my experience on funding committees. Try not to give too many secrets away, but to give some interesting insights, I hope. And then the various sort of stages that I was asked to cover on sort of early development work in projects, the kind of issues that arise at that stage. Feasibility studies, including pilot studies. Actually, as I came to do this, I've spent most of the time thinking, and as you'll see from the slides, on that part of the process. I think it's a particularly pertinent issue at the moment, for reasons you may agree or disagree with, and hopefully that'll become clear as I go through my presentation. And the influence of different types of study funding opportunities that we have, whether some of them make a difference, whether they don't, and to try and pull out some of the general as well as the specific issues. And then there'll be a few pretty random conclusions at the end, and hopefully some things for debate later on. Now, as I was thinking about this, and indeed as I was hearing the talk so far, I was trying to think, well, how much of this is about primary care and how much of it is more general? And I think clearly there are quite a few comments that I'll make that are generic beyond primary care, and hopefully those will be obvious. There are some, I think, that are, if not specific to primary care, then certainly particularly pertinent to that. And as this is based largely on my experience, there will be a tendency to cover those, and also to cover more about trials than observational studies. But I don't think many of the points that I'm making are that specific. Now, the first bullet point there, you can agree or disagree with. I've been around in this going for long enough to have seen different eras of funding opportunities, and I think we're in a pretty good one. How long it's going to last, of course, is another question, and the nature of which it will last is another question. But I can remember times where there was plenty of funding for smaller scale studies, but very little for larger scale studies. And then actually a rather curious point in time when almost the opposite was the case, where there were opportunities on national funding for large scale studies. But if you wanted to do earlier phase development work, it was actually quite difficult to do that. And I think we're now in an era where we've probably got both open to us, particularly that, as the last bullet point here says, there's a variety of funders, some of whom can only fund earlier development work and want to know where this is going to lead to, rather than necessarily feeling that they are going to fund the full definitive study. Methodological research, I think, has had a varied past in relation to the opportunities for funding. Given MRC and NIHR initiatives over the years, I think we're also currently in a not a bad place compared with where we have been. Of course, exactly what counts as methodological research and the breadth of which that is defined, and moving into kind of methodology and practice away from what individuals might think of as relatively pure methodological work, I think is an ongoing debate. So anybody who's involved in health research doesn't need to be told much of what's on this slide. The first one, I think, about the pressures on the NHS and the difficulties that we have of raising the R&D agenda up, and I think this is certainly true within primary care as well as acute care. There's varying priorities placed on that, and so many pressures that are increasing now, that we are in a period of difficulties in that respect. That we have to see that as a challenge, and we have to see ways in which we can make sure that we don't move backwards in that respect. But I think it's naive if we're thinking it doesn't exist. Likewise, a regulatory framework clearly needs further attention. I think we have made some progress on that, at least in principle, but there is still some way to go to improve that, in my opinion. Now, all these various issues and contexts impact on the kind of designs that are going to be feasible, which I think is what I'm going to try and focus on at some points in this talk. But at the same time, when we do have some difficulties, that's the time in which I think innovation can flourish. It does open up opportunities for new, more efficient designs, and I think we're seeing that through various initiatives that are increasing about some things that have already been described in talks so far, and adaptive designs clearly are another point to emphasise there. Whatever design you're going to do, whatever the context, whatever the challenge is, planning is essential. It sounds like an obvious point to make, but I think it's still worth saying, and I'll come through on this talk, I hope, to give an indication of where I think planning needs to be focused, particularly given the stage of the research that one's at, the development of the understanding of the research question, of the details of the intervention, the nuances of the context and the challenges. And this last bullet point is a personal bugbear. The other thing that I've noticed that through the years, proposals are getting longer and longer and longer. Every single part of a grant proposal clearly has proponents, and there's almost always a good rationale for them. But if you look at the stage we've got to now with the length of proposals, I think we do have to, certainly it's a challenge in the planning and conduct of research and getting it funded, let alone for the poor people who have to read them. So teamwork is clearly part of it, and I'm not going to go through this. This is just from the context of a commonly within a randomised trial, the kind of numbers of individuals involved in research right from the outset is large and involves coordination. And the next slide is supposed to be an indication of how, well, if leading researchers was ever like this, research teams, it certainly isn't now. So that moves us on to committees, and I've got the same. The first comment here is the same as the last one in putting proposals in. Grants committees have masses and masses of paperwork. I mean, if you've ever sat on a grants committee, I'm sure a number of you have. That's something that really is quite considerable and impacts, I'm sure, on the ways in which research gets considered in funding bodies. Having said that, and I've heard various people, quite senior people within funding bodies, who are now taking this particular problem on board to try and improve things, because anybody who's read a grant proposal from the perspective of a reviewer or a grant committee member will probably agree that even if you've got a grant proposal that sums to about 100 pages, the key bits are probably within about half a dozen. And so when thinking about that in terms of making the grant proposal in the first place and assessing them, that's something to bear in mind. And quite often, too much of the key paperwork is used in very general stuff about the background of the research and why the question is important, relatively little on exactly what it is the researchers are going to do. And I think from a statistical input point of view, and certainly in terms of design, we should make sure that sufficient space is given to what it is the research is going to involve in terms of design, to some extent analysis, depending on the nature of it, and to make sure that that gets adequate coverage, both in terms of clarity and depth. But also to indicate, and I'll come on to this in more detail later on in the talk, how much you can generally put in for certain at the stage of the research and proposal, and how much you need to acknowledge needs to be have more flesh put on the bone as one goes through the research. Clearly that's going to be more relevant for the longer scale research, more programmatic approach to research. So transparency in that respect, I think, is important. Now, grant committees, I think it's very fair to say, tend to be conservative in nature. You know, one can propound all sorts of reasons, group psychology to dealing with public money, to just the sort of ways in which the whole process seems to work. Probably relatively risk averse, but I've yet to feel uncomfortable about the level of objectivity in grants committees I've been involved with, and mostly, I'm not going to say where, but mostly, where the exceptions are, but mostly grants committees are keen to fund. So they're looking for reasons why research should be funded rather than being too negative. Innovation I think, remains a problem. So trying to be innovative and the opposite to risk averse in grant proposals, I think is still a problem. Mainly, I think, because grants committees want to be convinced that you can actually deliver. And whether we've quite got that balance right, I'd be interested in others' views on that. Certainly, my experience is that innovation can help, particularly in certain circumstances, but you still need to make sure that those who are looking at a grant proposal are convinced that you can deliver in the context of that innovation, whether it's innovation on design or analysis or some other aspects. Committee dynamics vary considerably. It's impossible to predict how it's going to work, so don't try and second guess how you think people are going to operate in that environment. Just put things in as you think you can deliver. There's no sense in which I can understate the next bullet point, which is that personal experience on grants committees is hugely beneficial. It's a constant learning curve. It doesn't matter how many times I've been a member of grants committees or indeed chaired them now, I still learn from that process, not just about committee dynamics, but also about the ways in which, not so much fashions, but the ways in which current thinking is, and aspects of grants committees that tend to be a turn-off or attractive. There's always things to learn. And the way that grants committees tend to work is also encapsulated in the same slide I had before, and some of you have been on grants committees that I've chaired. I'm not going to look at Kerry because she would be off this picture completely as a member of a grants committee that I've been trying to chair. This is definitely not how it works. Grants committees are very unpredictable, even if you think you know how they work and you know the people rather well. So, back to my kind of stages of study. Early development work, whether it's funded or not, quite often some of this work is before any formal grant funding is available. Clearly, it's not just a statistical matter. Often, most of it isn't statistical. Occasionally it is. There's some early psychometric work, for instance, that could be involved. It is, nonetheless, an opportunity to identify what are going to be the key statistical issues, whether it be about design or analysis, and gaps, for instance, in observational data on the likely outcomes. Even if one's not, giving statistical input, directly involved in this sort of early work, in my experience, it's still important to be aware and present at the discussions for all kinds of reasons. The nature of the intervention, the context of its delivery, all may have implications for what one's able to do from a statistical input at the relevant stage. And in any case, it helps in terms of early development of that team working that's going to be essential. So, a few slides now on feasibility studies, including pilot studies. When I started putting this together, I thought I was just going to have one slide here. I've got a lot more than that, because I say it seemed to be, at the moment, quite a bit to say. Often this isn't quantitative. Again, even in pilot trials, there are qualitative researchers who are going to be trying to get information about how recruitment is working, how interventions are described to potential participants, issues about equipoise and so on. And just the logistics of the whole thing may be just as important as the kind of things that we want to get out of pilot studies for statistical purposes. And all those things may indeed compete with one another. And this could just be a matter of timing. For instance, if in-depth interviews are going to take place, and that is before data are collected for quantitative purposes, could those in-depth interviews actually influence the kind of values that you get out. So sometimes those are in competition, and compromise is often necessary. Just in the last couple of weeks I've been involved in quite an interesting debate about that with a study I'm involved with. It's clearly still crucial to think, okay, what is it that I want for the kind of challenges that are going to come in putting a grant proposal, let alone conducting a research study from a statistical viewpoint in advance, and bring those perspectives to the discussion table even at this very early stage. Now, this first bullet point probably contains what I'd like to have as my main message from this talk. If we're talking about a grant proposal for a feasibility study, or particularly if it's a pilot study, then, or even just part of a grant proposal, then identifying what the objectives are of that feasibility study is really key. I can't tell you how many times I've looked at feasibility study grant proposals and been frustrated that what I'm really reading is a kind of mini main trial, where there's even a power calculation in there for the main trial with all of the assumptions that maybe need, and the amount of detail on what the pilot study, I'll get more specific now, a pilot trial is going to deliver in terms of recruitment and retention and the like, it gets about half a sentence. And I've got relatively little feeling that the understanding of how the current proposal, whether it's a standalone pilot feasibility study or the first phase of an NIHR program grant, for instance, what the objectives are, let alone the deliverability on those objectives for the purpose of the pilot study. So think about what the objectives are at that point of research, collect as much data as possible. I've given a list there, and having heard Sandra, I should have added, particularly in the context of cluster trials I'll talk about a bit later, the kind of cluster sizes and the variability in cluster sizes. So there's all sorts of information that is going to be useful, and getting an indication of what the outcome measure summary statistics might be, of course, is useful, whether they're, particularly if they're binary, but even if they're continuous measures. But again, something that one sees more often than should be the case, the justification for a sample size, a target difference in a sample size, while early work, including a pilot, might give an indication of the likely measures that you'll see, particularly in terms of absolute value, it shouldn't drive what the target difference is. Just because you see a difference of X percentage points in a pilot study, that's not the rationale for the justification for that being the target difference in the main study. What's clinically important clearly should drive that. So feasibility, the feasibility of that difference, you might get some insights in, but it shouldn't be the driver. So all sorts of initial questions, internal, external pilot. A slightly different question, of course, is, regardless of that, is this pilot study embedded in a larger grant proposal, or is it a sort of standalone one? Are you going to go for a smaller funding body or scheme within a funding body first to do that preliminary work, to then get all of that information, not just statistical, as I've said, but broaden that, and then proceed to a different grant proposal? Or are you going to have this as a first phase in a larger program grant, for instance? All sorts of influences on the answers to those, and I can't come up with any generalization, but one of the, whatever the answer is, one of the issues, the key issues here is how the level of uncertainty about some fairly fundamental issues. And clearly, the further down the road you are to having less uncertainty about this, the more inclined one would be to say, yes, I can put this in as part of an early part of a phased program, rather than needing to do it before even getting to that stage. What the outcomes are, particularly primary outcome, units of randomization, recruitment and retention, are just examples of those sorts of key issues from a statistical viewpoint. But again, there may well be much broader concerns that rather override those. Finally, on this issue, pragmatics, as I've just alluded to, may prevail over all of this, what the funding opportunities are, what the commissioned call is about, and so on. And of course, as the size of that feasibility study, whether it's a pilot trial or not, is also relevant. That's as I think most of us have experienced, often quite a tricky issue. How big does that study need to be? I mean, ideally, that if you really hone down on the objectives of the feasibility study, particularly if it's a pilot trial, that would in itself drive a kind of, at least in principle, sample size context, or context for a sample size justification for that. For example, you want to be able to claim a particular recruitment rate is going to be realistic. How big does your pilot need to be in order, if you get an estimate of that recruitment rate, to have a sufficiently narrow confidence interval? That's a pretty idealistic approach. We'd often like to do that. Getting a pilot study big enough to really narrow down a recruitment rate is a much tougher task. Personally, though, I'd rather at least see an indication of what that's likely to be, to convince me, at the very least, that the research team know that that is the important part of their pilot study, and that given their planned size of it, that this is the range of potential estimates that they're going to get, rather than just pretending that recruitment rate is really not what we're talking about and kind of fudge the issue of sample size. Again, a personal view. All of that, though, the feasibility pilot study objectives and focusing on them is key. So I was asked to talk a bit about cluster trials in particular. Sandra's already given a lot of these issues already, but just particularly to my remit, I guess, feasibility studies in that context, one I thought where they could particularly deliver on, again adding the comment of likely cluster sizes and variability in those cluster sizes, I would add to this list. You know, where is the intervention delivered? We might think we know the level at which is intended to be delivered, and sometimes that's pretty obvious, but occasionally, particularly if it's at the organisational level, exactly where the kind of levers on making the intervention at least operate more or less as it was intended are less clear. What the likely degree of clustering is, and maybe even unexpected sources of clustering. That's of course linked to the question of where the intervention really gets delivered. Differential recruitment and or retention, that's something that Sandra detailed about the importance of that, but also this is an opportunity to think of ways in which one might mitigate against those problems. A recent example, I'll be a bit coy about the details of it because we're still working on it, but having done a pilot trial of a cluster trial, we observed, albeit with very wide confidence intervals, a direction of difference on the primary outcome that was both completely opposite to what we expected and linked to that counterintuitive. And in thinking about that, and it's difficult to sort of entirely prove, but in thinking about that, we were looking at the evidence of differential recruitment in particular in that trial, which was a cluster trial. There was clear evidence of major differential recruitment in that pilot study that at least was a plausible explanation of that, what appeared to be totally counterintuitive direction of effect, let alone its magnitude. And so the design of the main trial in that case, we completely rethought. The design of the intervention, its delivery, the identification process is the kind of things that Sandra was mentioning. So all those things I think are particularly important, given that the dangers are much greater in a cluster trial to do a feasibility study for. And clearly, if you're going to put a main study proposal in, having gone through this process and at least given some reassurance about their consideration is important. So at the end of it, I just thought I'd cover just the general sort of methodological issues that come through. I won't spend much time on these, but clustering, the sorts of things that have already been discussed, random effects models are key. There may be different levels of clustering involved. We may have the effect of the context, whether they're general practices or larger health service organisations, but particular therapists that are delivering an intervention that may also be a source of clustering. Which one should be the focus of the allocation? Which ones we may need to investigate and at least potentially allow for an analysis are all key issues in when we've done the main study. Missing data has already been covered, and the nuances of not just the primary intention to treat, but also looking at trying to get, through causal effect modelling of various ways, of effects of treatment actually received are important. Types of study, if they're embedded in a large proposal, or I think, or even if not, then if one's involved in feasibility or particularly pilot studies, then clear stop, go, or continue, not continue, or adapt in a major or minor fashion criteria are quite impressive to see in grant proposals. When you can see a proposal that lays all those out, that's much, to me at least, much more impressive than getting lots of excessive detail about what the main trial might be if everything's going to work out, let alone huge details on the study background that I mentioned earlier. So, having said that, I think when we come to do that in practice, we're always a bit cautious to say, unless my recruitment rate is 70%, it's not going to be good enough. Well, if it was 69%, would that really put you off, or could you think of ways in which it would improve? So it is in practice, a temptation to be a little equivocal in relation to those stop-go criteria, and I think we have to acknowledge that. And I'm as guilty of trying to at least blur those sharp edges as much as possible as anybody else. But I think at least attempting to lay them down, even if there's a number of them, there's very rarely just one, then at least one's put that down in advance when one comes to try and justify proceeding to a main study later on. When there are smaller scale grants, and fellowship grant proposals are an example of that, it's important to be realistic about what can be achieved, and again, a personal view, preferable to do less but better. And then the decision about standalone within programme grants, I think, generally speaking, it's fairly clear, but I've covered some of those key issues already. And of course, there is no single solution to all this. Every single context and situation is different, and will quite reasonably come up with different detailed approaches in any given case. So of course, at the end of a study, you get through all this and everything's worked, you get your nice Lancet paper, which is fantastic, and if you're in a group that I was involved with for this, you're lucky, and somebody gives you a t-shirt for it, which is even nicer. In fact, given that there's so many people involved in this, not just one t-shirt, you have to have a whole load to really satisfy everybody. So, summarise some conclusions. Again, this is a personal view. Start at the beginning. Do get involved in those early stages. The old adage of contact a statistician at the early stages of a proposal, fine, but I think I'm really talking about even more upstream than that, of really the sort of early conceptual discussions about a whole load of things that even before one gets to the statistical issues, I think is important. Crucial to plan, but you have to be adaptable in all of these things. How adaptable will certainly influence the funding strategy that you adopt. Clarity of objectives are already laboured enough, but fit for the study purpose, and that's very early on. Don't try and ape the main proposal. Really focus on where you are at that particular stage. And stop-go criteria, plural, is a key part of the consideration. Thank you very much.